June 23, 1944. 11:47 p.m. Minsk, Belarus. Colonel Hans von Treskov stood in the officers' mess of Army Group Center headquarters, sharing cognac with fellow staff officers. Outside, the summer night was warm and quiet. The war felt distant, almost unreal. "Gentlemen," von Tresco raised his glass, "to another year of holding the line." Around him, officers laughed. They had every reason to feel confident. Army Group Center held Belarus like an iron fist, punching deep into Soviet territory. They'd controlled this ground for 3 years. They'd survived Soviet winter offensives, counterattacks, partisan raids. They were still here. Field Marshal Ernst Busch, commanding officer of the entire Army Group, had retired early that evening. He'd attended the opera earlier, Wagner, performed by a German touring company. The performance had been excellent. Life in Minsk resembled peacetime occupation more than active warfare. German intelligence reports sat on von Treskov's desk, unread. They all said the same thing. The next Soviet offensive would come in Ukraine, 600 miles south. Reconnaissance flights confirmed massive Soviet buildups there. Thousands of tanks, artillery concentrations, supply depots. Here in Belarus, the forests were quiet. German defensive positions were strong. Hitler himself had designated their fortress, cities, Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, Bobruisk, as Festerplätze, strongholds that must never fall. 500,000 German combat troops garrisoned these positions. Another 300,000 support personnel kept them supplied. The main road to Moscow ran through their lines. They were invincible. Von Tresco finished his cognac and checked his watch. It 11:52 p.m. In 8 minutes, it would be June 24th. Another day holding impregnable positions. Another day closer to negotiated peace that some officers still believed possible. At 4:00 a.m., 4 hours and 8 minutes later, Colonel von Tresco's world would cease to exist. But he didn't know that yet. None of them did. The German officers went to bed confident. By breakfast, their entire front would disappear. While history books obsess over D-Day, the Allied landing on Normandy beaches on June 6, 1944, they've somehow forgotten something bigger, something that happened 17 days later, 1,500 miles to the east. The moment 2.4 million Soviet soldiers made 500,000 Germans simply vanish. This isn't just another World War II battle story. This is the story of how the Red Army pulled off the greatest magic trick in military history. A deception so complete, so perfectly executed, that an entire German army group walked into annihilation without realizing the trap existed until it was too late. By June 1944, the strategic situation on the Eastern Front had crystallized into something resembling stalemate. German forces, pushed back from their furthest advance in 1942-43, had stabilized defensive lines roughly along pre-war Soviet borders. Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Ernst Busch, controlled the Belarusian salient, a bulge of German-occupied territory jutting eastward into Soviet lines like a massive fist. The Germans called it the Belarusian balcony. It represented both strategic advantage and potential vulnerability. The balcony provided jumping-off points for any future German offensive toward Moscow, but it also created a salient that could be attacked from 3 sides if the Soviets chose to do so. Hitler had addressed this vulnerability by converting major cities into Festerplätze, fortress cities that must be held at all costs. Vitebsk in the north, Orsha and Mogilev in the center, Bobruisk in the south. Each garrison received orders signed by Hitler personally. These fortresses would not fall. Commanders who suggested retreat would be executed. The psychology was simple. Immovable strongpoints would break Soviet attacks like rocks breaking waves. The Germans had used this strategy successfully in places. It would work here. Field Marshal Busch commanded impressive forces, approximately 500,000 combat troops organized into 3rd Panzer Army in the north, 4th Army in the center, and Ninth Army in the south. Another 300,000 support personnel kept this massive force supplied through rail lines running back to Germany. These weren't green recruits. Many had fought since 1941. They'd survived 3 years of the Eastern Front's brutality. They knew the Red Army's capabilities. They respected Soviet soldiers but believed German discipline and defensive skill would prevail. German intelligence had identified the next Soviet offensive's location with certainty. Ukraine, specifically the Lvov-Przemysl sector, 600 miles south of Belarus. The evidence was overwhelming. Reconnaissance aircraft photographed massive Soviet tank concentrations south of Kiev. Hundreds of T-34s, visible from the air, arranged in obvious attack formations. Artillery parks containing thousands of guns. Supply depots stacked with ammunition and fuel. Radio intercept stations recorded Soviet communications discussing the southern offensive. Division commanders requesting reinforcements. Tank units reporting mechanical readiness. Artillery batteries confirming fire plans. It was so obvious that German intelligence barely questioned it. Soviet forces were massing in Ukraine. The attack would come there. Every indicator pointed south, so Hitler sent his reserves south. Panzer divisions that might have reinforced Army Group Center were redirected to Ukraine. Every spare tank, every mobile unit went to meet the threat everyone could see developing. In Minsk, German officers attended cultural events. They hosted dinner parties. Supply officers worried about wine stocks and whether the German touring opera company would return. One colonel wrote to his wife, "The Russians are finished here. We see them massing in the south, but they're too weak to attack our positions. We'll hold Belarus indefinitely." The confidence was universal, absolute, and completely wrong. Because right then, at that exact moment, 7 million Soviet soldiers were hiding in the Belarusian forests. They were less than 30 miles from German lines. Some reconnaissance units were within 500 yards of German positions, so close they could hear German soldiers talking. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky commanded Soviet forces in the north. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the Soviet Union's greatest military commander, coordinated the entire operation from Moscow. Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, chief of the General Staff, had spent 3 months planning every detail. They'd been assembling this force for 3 months. The Germans had built their entire defensive strategy on a lie they didn't know they'd been told. The question seems impossible. How do you hide 2.4 million soldiers, 5,200 tanks, 5,300 aircraft, and 70,000 vehicles from German reconnaissance? The Soviets had spent 3 years perfecting the answer. They called it Maskirovka, the art of military deception. It would become the Red Army's greatest weapon in Operation Bagration. Maskirovka wasn't just camouflage or fake radio traffic. It was systematic, comprehensive deception operating at every level simultaneously. Strategic deception convinced German high command to look in the wrong direction. Operational deception hid massive troop movements. Tactical deception concealed individual units from German observers. The deception had 2 components: what you hide and what you show, what the Soviets hid. Every night, Soviet tank columns moved forward toward their assembly areas near the German lines. Before dawn, soldiers swept away every track with pine branches. German reconnaissance flights at sunrise saw only pristine forest floor. No tracks, no disturbance, nothing. Colonel General Sergei Shtemenko personally checked these sweeping operations. One missed track could expose everything. Shtemenko walked suspected routes himself, looking for any sign that thousands of soldiers had passed. He found none. The sweeping was perfect. Soviet forces moving into Belarus maintained total radio silence. Not one transmission. Radio operators sat at their equipment but never transmitted. Messages moved by courier or through dedicated telephone lines buried 6 feet underground. The radio silence was absolute. Partisan fighters, Soviet irregular forces operating behind German lines, cut German communication lines systematically. A German outpost would report Soviet movement, then lose phone connection before details could be relayed. The information died in isolated headquarters that couldn't call for help. Soviet soldiers couldn't write letters home. Security was so tight that families went months without word. Private Mikhail Frolov later remembered, "For 2 months, my mother thought I was dead. We couldn't send any word. We just waited in the forests, invisible. I wanted to tell her I was alive, but I couldn't. Thousands of mothers thought their sons were dead because we had to stay hidden." Movement happened only at night. During daylight, Soviet soldiers hid under forest canopy so thick that aerial reconnaissance couldn't penetrate it. They dug foxholes and covered them with branches. They stayed motionless for 12-hour stretches. German reconnaissance pilots flew overhead, photographed empty forests, and reported no enemy presence. Supply convoys traveled only after dark. Tens of thousands of trucks bringing ammunition, fuel, and food moved exclusively at night. Before dawn, they dispersed into forests and hid under camouflage netting. German pilots photographing the same roads daily saw no traffic. The roads appeared abandoned. Artillery pieces, thousands of them, were positioned in forests and covered with netting and branches arranged to match surrounding foliage. From the air, they were invisible. German photo interpreters studied reconnaissance images of Soviet-held forests and identified nothing unusual. The deception extended to individual soldiers. Men were ordered not to light fires for cooking. No fires meant no smoke. No smoke meant no visible signs from the air. Soldiers ate cold rations for weeks because hot meals would give away positions. What the Soviets showed. In Ukraine, where Germans expected the attack, Soviet engineers built an entire fake army. They called it the Maskirovka complex. A carefully constructed illusion designed to convince German intelligence that the main offensive would come from the south. They constructed 85,000 dummy vehicles, inflatable tanks that looked real from 5,000 feet, wooden artillery pieces painted to match real guns, fake fuel dumps made from painted barrels arranged in realistic patterns, dummy aircraft parked at airfields that reconnaissance would photograph. The fake tanks were engineering marvels. Inflatable frames covered with painted canvas, they could be set up in hours and moved easily. From reconnaissance aircraft, they were indistinguishable from real T-34s. German photo interpreters counted hundreds of tanks that didn't exist. Soviet engineers even created phantom headquarters. They built structures that looked like command posts, strung communication wires between them, and positioned dummy vehicles nearby. German reconnaissance photographed these facilities and marked them on intelligence maps as genuine Soviet command centers. Radio operators transmitted fake orders in codes they knew Germans had broken. Send more ammunition to Sector 12. Tank Battalion 45 needs fuel. Prepare winter positions for defensive operations. All lies. But German intelligence wrote it all down, analyzed it, and incorporated it into their assessment of Soviet intentions. The radio traffic was carefully scripted. Soviet intelligence officers wrote realistic-sounding orders that would convince German interceptors they were hearing genuine communications. The false orders mentioned unit designations, supply requirements, and tactical movements, all pointing toward a Ukrainian offensive. They even staged fake training exercises that German reconnaissance could observe. Tank units in Ukraine practiced river crossings and assault tactics in areas visible from German-held territory. German observers reported these activities, reinforcing the deception that Ukraine was the target. Meanwhile, the real Soviet forces in Belarus maintained total silence. Radio operators sat idle. Reconnaissance units avoided contact. The massive buildup proceeded invisibly while German attention focused 600 miles away. German intelligence took thousands of reconnaissance photographs. They showed massive Soviet forces in Ukraine preparing for offensive operations. They showed empty forests in Belarus with no sign of enemy activity. German photo interpreters drew the obvious conclusion: the Soviets would attack in Ukraine. A captured German intelligence officer later admitted, "We photographed exactly what they wanted us to see." Every reconnaissance mission confirmed our expectations. We were blind, deaf, and dumb. We saw an army in Ukraine and nothing in Belarus. We believed what we wanted to believe. Marshal Zhukov later described the deception. "We spent 3 months preparing Operation Bagration. Half that time was spent on combat planning. The other half was devoted to hiding our preparations. The deception was as important as the attack itself. If the Germans discovered our intentions, they would shift forces north and our advantage would disappear. Everything depended on surprise. The deception worked perfectly." By June 22, 1944, exactly 3 years after Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, German intelligence was absolutely certain about Soviet offensive plans. The attack would come in Ukraine. Belarus was quiet. Army Group Center could hold with current forces. They were catastrophically wrong. June 22, 1944. Soviet reconnaissance units probed German lines across Belarus. Small attacks, nothing serious. A few dozen men testing German positions, exchanging fire, then withdrawing. German commanders logged these incidents as local harassment or partisan activity. They laughed about it. One German battalion commander noted in his diary, "Russians launched their offensive today. About 40 men who ran away after we fired a few machine gun bursts. Is this the best they can manage? Symbolic harassment on the anniversary of Barbarossa. The reconnaissance wasn't harassment. It was final preparation." Soviet commanders were confirming German positions one last time, identifying strong points, checking fields of fire, updating maps. Every piece of information would matter in 36. The hours. June 23, 1944. 4:00 a.m. the forest exploded. Soviet divisions attacked simultaneously across a 450-mile front. The artillery barrage was so intense that German soldiers 20 miles behind the front couldn't hear each other scream. Private Wilhelm Hoffmann of the 267th Infantry Division was asleep in his dugout when the barrage began. He later described the moment. "The earth became liquid. That's the only way I can describe it. The ground wasn't solid anymore. It moved like ocean waves. Explosions everywhere, continuous, overlapping. The noise was physical. It pushed you down. Men were screaming, but I couldn't hear them. I could only see mouths opening. Everything was orange fire and black smoke and earth fountaining into the air." The Soviet artillery preparation lasted 90 minutes. Over 30,000 artillery pieces fired simultaneously. The barrage consumed ammunition stockpiled over 3 months. Soviet artillerymen fired until their guns overheated, then fired more. German defensive positions simply ceased to exist. Trenches collapsed. Dugouts buried occupants alive. Communication lines were severed. Command posts were destroyed. Within the first hour, German frontline units lost contact with headquarters. They couldn't report what was happening because they didn't know. They were fighting for survival in their individual positions with no wider context. At 5:30 a.m., the barrage lifted. For 30 seconds, silence. German survivors emerged from dugouts, dazed, bleeding from ears, barely able to stand. Then Soviet tanks appeared. T-34 medium tanks and heavy KV-1s, thousands of them, advancing in waves. Infantry followed in trucks or on foot. Aircraft overhead. Soviet Sturmovix diving to strafe any German position that showed resistance. Soviet tank columns didn't stop for German strongpoints. They flowed around them like water around rocks. If a German position resisted, Soviet forces bypassed it, encircled it, and left it for follow-up infantry to eliminate. The tanks kept moving west, penetrating deep into German rear areas. Within hours, entire German divisions were cut off, surrounded, trapped. Communication broke down completely. Battalion commanders couldn't reach regiment. Regiments couldn't reach division. Division commanders couldn't reach corps or army headquarters. German military doctrine assumed functioning communications. When communications failed, the entire command structure collapsed. Units fought individual battles with no coordination, no mutual support. no understanding of the wider situation. Field Marshal Busch, commanding Army Group Center, received fragmented reports throughout the morning. An attack in the north near Vitebsk, another in the center near Orsha, something happening near Bobruisk in the south. But the scale wasn't clear. Were these local attacks? Probing operations? Or something worse? By 10 a.m., the truth became undeniable. This wasn't local harassment. This was catastrophic. Busch grabbed his phone. He called Hitler's headquarters at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia. He needed to speak with Hitler personally. The situation was desperate, an aide answered. The Führer was sleeping. He couldn't be disturbed. Wake him, Busch demanded. The entire army group is under attack. Hitler finally came to the phone at 11 a.m., 7 hours after the offensive began. Busch explained as much as he understood. Massive Soviet attack, positions overrun, communications failing, units surrounded. We need permission to conduct fighting withdrawals, Busch said. Pull back to defensible lines. We can't hold these positions. Hitler's response was immediate and absolute. No, every fortress city must hold. Not one step back. The fortress city order, Hitler's strategic vision for the Eastern Front, would doom Army Group Center. Instead of allowing flexible defense that could adapt to Soviet attacks, Hitler demanded static defense of positions that were already cut off and surrounded. By noon, on June 23rd, Soviet tanks had penetrated 20 miles into German rear areas. By nightfall, they'd advanced 35 miles. The German front line wasn't retreating, it was dissolving. The German 3rd Panzer Army, elite mechanized units that had conquered half of Europe, found themselves encircled at Vitebsk within 48 hours. General Friedrich Gollwitzer commanded 35,000 men there, 5 divisions that Hitler had designated as the Vitebsk Fortress Garrison. When Soviet forces attacked on June 23rd, Gollwitzer requested permission to withdraw while escape routes remained open. Hitler's headquarters refused. Vitebsk was a fortress. Fortresses don't retreat. By June 25th, Soviet forces had surrounded Vitebsk completely. Gollwitzer's 35,000 men were trapped. No supplies could reach them. No reinforcements could arrive. They were simply cut off and isolated deep behind Soviet lines. Gollwitzer tried everything. His divisions attacked repeatedly, attempting to break the encirclement. Soviet forces absorbed these attacks and tightened the ring. Luftwaffe transport aircraft tried to airdrop supplies, but Soviet fighters controlled the skies. Most German supply planes were shot down before reaching Vitebsk. Inside the pocket, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Food ran out. Medical supplies were exhausted. Ammunition dwindled. Wounded soldiers lay in makeshift hospitals with no morphine, no bandages, no hope of evacuation. Private Klaus Neuhaus, trapped in Vitebsk, kept a diary until June 26th. June 23rd, massive Russian attack. We're holding, but casualties are heavy. June 24th, we're surrounded. Captain says help is coming. June 25th, no help, no food, Russians everywhere. June 26th, this is the end. If anyone finds this diary, tell my parents The entry ended there. Neuhaus was killed by Soviet artillery that afternoon. On June 27th, after holding out for 4 days without supplies or hope, Gollwitzer defied Hitler's orders. He ordered a breakout attempt. It was either try to escape or wait to be annihilated. At dawn on June 27th, 8,000 German soldiers, all who remained combat effective from the original 35,000, attempted to break through Soviet lines. Soviet forces were waiting. Machine guns, artillery, and tanks concentrated on the narrow corridor where Germans tried to escape. The breakout failed catastrophically. Soviet accounts describe German soldiers advancing in desperate waves, being cut down by concentrated fire. Bodies piled up in the killing zones. Those who made it through were pursued by Soviet tanks and hunted down in forests. Of 35,000 German soldiers trapped at Vitebsk, fewer than 500 escaped. The rest were killed or captured. The Vitebsk garrison, an entire corps of experienced German soldiers, effectively ceased to exist in 4 days. But Vitebsk was only the beginning. At Bobruisk in the south, 70,000 Germans found themselves in a similar trap. General Gotthard Hofmeister commanded the 9th Army's XXIve Corps there. Unlike Gollwitzer, Hofmeister saw the disaster developing and requested permission to withdraw on June 24th, before the encirclement closed completely. Hitler's headquarters refused. Bobruisk was a fortress. It would not fall. By June 27th, Soviet tanks had surrounded Bobruisk from 3 sides, with the Berezina River blocking escape to the west. Hofmeister's 70,000 men were trapped in a closing vise. Inside Bobruisk, Soviet artillery turned the city into hell. One German soldier, Private Heinz Koch, wrote a final letter to his family. "The entire city burns. Russians shell us every minute. We have no food, no medical supplies. The wounded scream all night. Command says, 'Hold.' Hold what? There's nothing left. Buildings collapse on top of us. Dead bodies everywhere. The smell is unbearable. We're going to die here. They're going to bury us in this rubble and no one will remember we existed." Koch's letter was found on his body after Soviet forces captured Bobruisk. General Hofmeister knew his men would die if they stayed. On June 27th, like Gollwitzer at Vitebsk, he disobeyed Hitler's orders. He ordered a breakout. 1,000 men attempted to escape the Bobruisk pocket. Soviet forces slaughtered them in open fields. German soldiers, abandoning their heavy weapons and vehicles, tried to wade across the Berezina River. Soviet aircraft strafed them in the water. Soviet artillery fired into the packed columns on the riverbanks. The Berezina crossing became a massacre. Thousands of Germans drowned or were shot in the water. Their bodies floated downstream for days afterward. Only 15,000 Germans from Bobruisk's garrison of 70,000 survived the breakout attempt. The rest died in the pocket or during the escape. Soviet forces filmed the aftermath. The footage preserved in Soviet military archives shows landscapes covered with German corpses, burned-out tanks, and abandoned equipment. One Soviet cameraman wrote, "I've filmed 3 years of war. I've seen Stalingrad, Kursk, countless battles. I've never seen destruction like this. The Germans are simply being erased." Hitler's fortress city strategy, designed to create immovable strongpoints that would break Soviet attacks, instead created death traps that destroyed entire German formations. Vitebsk fell on June 26th, 4 days after the offensive began. Orsha fell on June 27th. Mogilev on June 28th. Each fortress city Hitler demanded must hold forever fell within days. German commanders at each location followed the same pattern. Request permission to withdraw, receive denial from Hitler's headquarters, fight desperate defensive battles, watch their forces disintegrate, finally disobey orders and attempt breakouts that came too late. The operational pattern was consistent. Soviet forces would surround a fortress city, cutting supply lines and escape routes. German garrison commanders, realizing they were trapped, would radio Hitler's headquarters requesting permission for fighting withdrawal. Hitler would refuse, ordering them to hold at all costs. The garrison would fight for several days, consuming remaining supplies and ammunition. Finally, with no other option, the commander would disobey Hitler's orders and attempt a breakout. The breakout would occur after Soviet encirclement was complete, resulting in massacre of German forces trying to escape. At Mogilev, 12,000 German soldiers held the city for 6 days. They requested permission to withdraw on June 23rd, when escape was still possible. Hitler refused. By June 28th, when they finally attempted to break out without permission, Soviet forces had completely surrounded the city. Only 2,000 Germans escaped. The other 10,000 were killed or captured. These weren't random casualties. These were deliberate annihilations caused by Hitler's refusal to allow flexible defense. German commanders understood the tactical situation. They knew their positions were untenable. They requested permission to withdraw to defensible lines. Hitler repeatedly refused, prioritizing symbolic holding of territory over survival of his armies. Field Marshal Busch, commanding Army Group Center, flew to Hitler's headquarters on June 28th. He'd lost contact with multiple divisions. His army group was disintegrating. He needed authority to order general retreat before Soviet encirclements destroyed everything. Busch presented the situation to Hitler personally. "My Führer, Army Group Center has lost 25 divisions in 5 days. We must withdraw to defensible positions immediately, or we'll lose everything." Hitler's response was to fire him, immediately, on the spot. "You lack will," Hitler told Busch. "Your defeatism is unacceptable. You're relieved of command." Hitler replaced Busch with Field Marshal Walter Model, known as the Führer's fireman, for his reputation of stabilizing crumbling fronts. But even Model couldn't put out this fire. Model arrived at Army Group Center headquarters on June 28th to find an army group that effectively no longer existed as a functional fighting force. Of 47 divisions that had defended Belarus, 31 had been destroyed or reduced to ineffective remnants. The others were retreating in disorder, pursued by Soviet forces. Model sent one message to Hitler. "The army group no longer exists as a fighting force. Request authority to withdraw all remaining units to defensive positions behind the Bug River." Even Model's authority couldn't overcome Hitler's rigidity. Permission for general retreat was denied. Individual units could withdraw if necessary, but no organized retreat would be authorized. The distinction was meaningless. With or without permission, German forces were retreating, or being destroyed where they stood. While fortress garrisons died in their pockets, Soviet tank columns raced west toward the greatest prize: Minsk. Minsk was Army Group Center's main supply hub. Every bullet, every gallon of fuel, every bandage, every replacement soldier passed through Minsk's rail yards and supply depots. Capture Minsk, and every German unit east of the city would be cut off from supply. Marshal Rokossovsky's tank corps drove toward Minsk from the north. Marshal Georgy Zakharov's forces approached from the south. The race was on. Could Soviet forces capture Minsk before Germans could evacuate or reinforce it? Soviet tank commanders pushed their units mercilessly. Columns advanced 60 miles per day, a pace that seemed impossible for armies carrying everything they needed for sustained combat. T-34 tanks rolled continuously, drivers taking turns sleeping while vehicles kept moving. Soviet logistics officers had calculated fuel requirements precisely. Each tank unit carried just enough fuel to reach Minsk. Once there, supply columns would catch up. There was no margin for error. If tanks ran out of fuel short of Minsk, they'd be stranded in German-held territory. The gamble worked. On July 3rd, just 11 days after the offensive began, lead elements of Soviet Second Guards Tank Corps entered Minsk's outskirts. The city's German garrison, consisting mainly of supply and administrative troops, offered minimal resistance. By evening, Soviet tanks controlled Minsk's rail yards and supply depots. 100,000 German soldiers were now trapped east of Minsk. They had no supplies, no fuel, no escape route, and no hope. These weren't garrison troops in fortress cities. These were mobile field divisions, supposedly the most capable German units designed to maneuver and fight combined arms battles. But they were trapped just as completely as fortress garrisons had been. The trapped Germans faced impossible choices. Surrender to the Soviets, which meant almost certain death in prisoner-of-war camps where survival rates were horrific. Or try to break through Soviet lines and reach German positions west of Minsk, which meant fighting through miles of Soviet-controlled territory with no supplies, no ammunition resupply, and no air support. Most chose to try escaping. They organized into Kampfgruppen, battle groups of whatever units could be assembled. A regiment from one division, 2 battalions from another, a battery of artillery, some tanks if any fuel remained. These improvised formations would attempt to break west. Soviet forces were waiting. Intelligence reports identified German escape routes. Soviet units positioned themselves to intercept retreating columns. The result was a series of running battles as German Kampfgruppen tried to punch through Soviet positions. Few succeeded. Soviet accounts describe German columns advancing desperately, being engaged by Soviet armor and artillery, breaking apart under fire. German soldiers would abandon vehicles and try to escape on foot through forests. Soviet infantry and partisan units hunted them down. Private Wilhelm Hoffmann, whose division was trapped east of Minsk, kept a diary until July 5th. June 25th. Russians appeared from nowhere. Captain Miller shot himself rather than surrender. We're running west, trying to reach our lines. Those who can't run are left behind. June 28th. Our regiment is down to 200 men from 2,000. No food for 3 days. We eat grass and tree bark. Horses were killed and eaten raw. July 2nd. Minsk has fallen. We're cut off completely. Major ordered us to break into small groups and try to reach German lines individually. Good luck to all. July 5th. 6 of us left. Others killed or captured. We hide in forests during day, move at night. My feet are bleeding. I can barely walk. This may be my last entry. Hoffmann was captured by Soviet forces on July the 7th. He survived the war. Stalin wanted the world to see what the Red Army had done. On July 17, 1944, Moscow witnessed something unprecedented in modern warfare. 1,000 German prisoners marched through the capital streets in a victory parade. They walked 20 abreast in columns that stretched for miles. The procession took 90 minutes to pass through Red Square. These weren't ordinary soldiers. Among the prisoners were 19 German generals, men who once commanded entire armies, who'd been photographed in victory parades through Paris and Belgrade, who'd been celebrated as heroes of the Reich. Now they shuffled through Moscow in tattered uniforms, unshaven, exhausted, defeated, their boots worn through, their uniforms dirty and torn. No pride left, no hope, just endless gray columns of the vanquished. Soviet citizens lined the streets, 500,000 of them. Some spat at the passing Germans. Some threw stones or garbage. Most just stared in silence, watching the invaders who had killed 27 million Soviet people now reduced to prisoners stumbling through their capital. The symbolism was carefully choreographed. These were the same streets where German soldiers had expected to march in victory parade in 1941. Hitler's planners had selected buildings in Moscow to use as headquarters for the occupation government. They'd prepared victory celebrations, planned occupation administration, designed monuments to German conquest. Instead, German soldiers marched through Moscow as prisoners, the visible proof of total defeat. Journalist Vasily Grossman watched from Red Square and wrote, "They walked with their eyes down, shuffling their feet. No military bearing remained. The proud Wehrmacht officers who'd conquered Europe were broken men. They didn't look at the crowds. They didn't look at each other. They just walked, one foot in front of the other, accepting their fate." The generals drew particular attention. Major General Robert Bamler, who'd commanded German 12th Infantry Division. Lieutenant General Vincenz Müller, former commander of XXXIX Panzer Corps. Major General Alphonse Hitter, whose division had been annihilated at Vitebsk. These men had worn Knight's Crosses and oak leaf clusters, Germany's highest military decorations. They'd dined with Hitler, briefed senior Nazi officials, commanded thousands of soldiers. Now they marched through Moscow under guard. Their military careers ended in catastrophic defeat. After the prisoners passed, street cleaning trucks followed. They sprayed water and disinfectant on the pavement, literally washing away where Germans had walked. The symbolism was clear. The Nazi stain was being erased from Soviet territory. Foreign journalists covering the parade filed reports that shocked readers in London, New York, and other Allied capitals. The scale of German defeat seemed impossible. 57,000 prisoners in a single parade meant tens of thousands more killed in battle. How had this happened? How had an entire German army group been destroyed so completely? The Moscow Victory Parade demonstrated Soviet power in ways that conventional military victories couldn't. Parading captured enemy generals through your capital showed total dominance. It proved the Red Army had transformed from the desperate, retreating force of 1941 into an unstoppable military machine. Soviet propaganda made extensive use of the footage. Newsreels showing defeated Germans marching through Moscow played in theaters across the Soviet Union and were distributed to Allied nations. The message was unmistakable. Germany was being crushed. The numbers were staggering. In 5 weeks, Operation Bagration had achieved something unprecedented in modern warfare. 50,000 Germans killed, wounded, or captured, losses exceeding German casualties at Stalingrad despite taking half the time. Divisions completely eliminated, not just defeated, but destroyed as functioning military formations. The Wehrmacht lost more men in 5 weeks of Operation Bagration than in 5 months at Stalingrad. The destruction exceeded losses at Kursk. It was the single most devastating defeat German forces experienced in World War II. Army Group Center, which had held Belarus for 3 years, ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The units that remained were fragments, battalion-sized remnants of divisions, companies that were all that survived of regiments. Soviet forces advanced 450 miles in 5 weeks. They liberated all of Belarus, pushed into Poland, and reached the German border. For the first time since 1941, Soviet soldiers stood on the edge of enemy territory, preparing for the invasion that would end the war. The operational achievement exceeded even optimistic Soviet planning. Marshal Zhukov had estimated Operation Bagration would destroy 20 to 25 German divisions over 8 and 10 weeks. Instead, 31 divisions were annihilated in 5 weeks. Captured German General Friedrich Gollwitzer, during interrogation, told his Soviet captors, "We never imagined such deception was possible. You made us look exactly where you wanted. We saw massive forces in Ukraine and believed the attack would come there. When we finally saw the truth, when your forces erupted from forests we thought were empty, it was too late. Everything collapsed in days. There was no time to adjust, no reserves to commit, no way to stop it." Another captured general, Vincenz Miller, provided technical analysis. "Your Maskirovka was perfect. Every intelligence indicator pointed south. Reconnaissance showed nothing in Belarus. We had no reason to doubt our assessments. When the attack came, we thought it was a local operation, perhaps a diversion to draw forces from Ukraine. By the time we understood the truth, your tanks were already in our rear areas cutting supply lines. The speed of your advance was unlike anything we'd experienced. The Red Army had transformed utterly from the force that nearly collapsed in 1941. That army had been unprepared, poorly led, lacking in tactics. The army of 1944 had learned everything: German encirclement tactics, combined arms operations, deep battle theory, and deception at operational and strategic scale. They'd taken German military innovation, blitzkrieg, deep penetration, encirclement, and improved it with overwhelming force and systematic deception. The result was unstoppable. Private Mikhail Frolov, who had hidden in Belarusian forests for months waiting for the offensive, finally wrote to his mother, "We did it, Mama. We destroyed them all. The Germans who came to our country, who burned our villages, who killed our people, we've destroyed their army. Berlin is next. I'll be home when it's finished." Operation Bagration achieved what Stalingrad and Kursk had begun. It broke the Wehrmacht's spine. It proved the Red Army had become Earth's most powerful military force, capable of destroying entire army groups in weeks. Yet today, in the West, the battle remains largely forgotten. Every schoolchild knows about D-Day, the Allied landing on Normandy beaches on June 6, 1944. The invasion is remembered as the decisive turning point of World War II in Europe. Films, documentaries, books, and video games have immortalized the Normandy campaign. But ask those same students about Operation Bagration. conducted by forces 10 times larger just 3 weeks later, and you'll receive blank stares. The disparity in historical memory reflects Cold War politics more than military reality. After 1945, as the Soviet Union and Western democracies became adversaries, Western historians downplayed Soviet military achievements while emphasizing Western Allied contributions. D-Day. In this narrative becomes the moment that doomed Germany, brave American and British soldiers storming heavily defended beaches, fighting through hedgerows, liberating France, and pushing toward Germany. The Soviet contribution gets reduced to they had massive numbers, or they suffered enormous casualties but eventually won through attrition. The reality was different. While D-Day was important for opening a second front in Western Europe, the decisive battles of World War II were fought on the Eastern Front where 80% of German military casualties occurred. Operation Bagration, not D-Day, represents the moment when German defeat became inevitable. When the Normandy invasion began on June 6th, Germany still controlled most of Eastern Europe and had organized defensive lines. 6 weeks later, after Bagration, Army Group Center had been annihilated, Soviet forces were entering Poland, and Germany's ability to defend itself was fundamentally compromised. Contemporary military analysts understood this. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, despite being allied with the Soviets against Germany, recognized Operation Bagration's significance. In communications with Stalin, Churchill called it this magnificent victory and the greatest achievement of the Red Army. German commanders certainly understood. When Field Marshal Walter Model, brought in to stabilize the situation after Busch's dismissal, reviewed the damage, he reported to Hitler, "Army Group Center has effectively ceased to exist. The losses cannot be replaced. The Soviets have shattered our defensive capabilities in the East. We can slow their advance but cannot stop it." Hitler's response was to demand more fortress cities, more static defense, more orders forbidding retreat. He'd learned nothing. The Eastern Front's scale exceeded Western comprehension. While Allied forces in France numbered around 1 million by August 1944, the Eastern Front involved over 6 million soldiers on each side. A single Soviet operation, Bagration, employed more soldiers than the entire Western Allied invasion force. The equipment numbers were similarly staggering. Operation Bagration involved 5,200 Soviet tanks. The entire Normandy invasion employed about 2,000 Allied tanks total. Soviet artillery preparation for Bagration used more ammunition in 90 minutes than the entire Allied artillery barrage supporting D-Day. Yet the Western narrative persists. D-Day was the decisive operation that won the war. The Soviet contribution was important but secondary. This narrative served Cold War purposes by minimizing the military achievements of the nation that became America's primary adversary. Modern historians have begun correcting this imbalance, recognizing Operation Bagration as one of history's most successful military operations. The combination of strategic deception, operational planning, tactical execution, and overwhelming force created results that exceed even the German Blitzkrieg operations of 1939 to 41. But popular memory changes slowly. The average person still doesn't know about Operation Bagration, the greatest land battle in history, the operation that destroyed an entire German army group and opened the road to Berlin, remains forgotten in Western consciousness. Perhaps it reminds us of an uncomfortable truth. The war's outcome wasn't decided on Normandy's beaches. It was decided in the forests of Belarus, where Soviet mastery of deception and overwhelming force created a trap so perfect that an entire German army group simply vanished into history. Behind the statistics, 450,000 German casualties, 31 divisions destroyed, 450 miles advanced, were individual human stories of suffering, survival, and death. For German soldiers trapped in the encirclements, the experience was nightmare made real. Cut off from supply, watching ammunition run out, knowing rescue wouldn't come, they faced impossible choices. Lieutenant Hans Schmidt commanded a company in the 267th Infantry Division, trapped east of Minsk. His final letters home, smuggled out by a wounded soldier evacuated before the encirclement closed, described the deterioration. June 24th. Heavy Soviet attacks all day. We're holding, but taking casualties. Supply situation normal. Morale acceptable. June 27th. We've been surrounded. Ammunition is rationed. Food supplies running low. Command says breakthrough forces are coming. We must hold out. June 30th. No breakthrough forces have arrived. We eat once per day. Wounded lie untreated. We have no morphine, no bandages. Men are beginning to talk about surrender. I shoot anyone who mentions it. We're German soldiers. We don't surrender. July 2nd. Perhaps we should have surrendered. The wounded are dying. We have no food. Ammunition almost gone. The Soviets shell us continuously. This pocket is a grave. We're already dead, just waiting for it to be official. Schmidt was killed on July 3rd during a Soviet assault on his position. His letters were found on a prisoner who'd survived. Soviet soldiers, despite their victory, paid enormous costs. Soviet casualties for Operation Bagration totaled approximately 180,000 killed and wounded, lower than German losses but still substantial. Soviet operational doctrine accepted high casualties in exchange for rapid advance and operational success. Soviet infantry, advancing behind tank columns, faced German defensive fire from bypassed strong points. Soviet aircraft faced anti-aircraft fire. Soviet tank crews dealt with mechanical breakdowns, fuel shortages, and German anti-tank weapons. Lieutenant Ivan Kozlov commanded a T-34 tank in the advance toward Minsk. His memoir, published in 1975, described the reality of Soviet armored warfare. We advanced so fast we outran our supply lines. For 3 days we had no fuel deliveries. We siphoned fuel from damaged tanks to keep moving. We ate whatever we found, German rations from abandoned supply dumps, food from liberated villages, sometimes nothing. Sleep came in 30-minute intervals between engagements. I'd fall asleep sitting in my tank, wake when we made contact with Germans, fight until they withdrew or we destroyed them, then fall asleep again. My crew and I lived in that tank for 12 days straight. We didn't bathe, couldn't change clothes. We urinated in empty shell casings and threw them outside. The smell inside was unbearable, but we stopped noticing. 3 times we took hits from German anti-tank guns. Once the shell penetrated but didn't detonate. We were incredibly lucky. Another time it hit our engine. We abandoned the tank, commandeered a captured German vehicle, and kept advancing. When we finally reached the Bug River and were rotated back for rest, I'd lost 15 pounds. My crew looked like ghosts, but we'd helped destroy an entire German army group. It was worth it. For Soviet partisans, irregular forces operating behind German lines, Operation Bagration represented vindication after years of desperate guerrilla warfare. They'd survived German anti-partisan operations, hung on despite horrific casualties, maintained resistance when victory seemed impossible. Now regular Soviet forces were advancing, liberating the territories partisans had fought to defend. Partisan commander Fyodor Markov described liberation of his home region. When Soviet tanks entered our district, we emerged from forest where we'd hidden for 3 years. Some partisans were meeting their families for the first time since 1941. Children didn't recognize their fathers. Wives thought their husbands were dead. We showed Soviet commanders German positions we'd been observing for years. We guided tank columns through terrain we knew perfectly. We hunted down German soldiers trying to escape through forests. For 3 years, we'd been hunted like animals. Now we were the hunters. It felt like justice. Returned to June 23, 1944, 11:47 p.m. Colonel Hans von Treschow finishing cognac in the officers' mess. German officers confident in their positions. Certain the next Soviet offensive would come in Ukraine, relaxed in the knowledge that Belarus was secure. They went to bed confident. They woke to annihilation. In 23 days, 500,000 German soldiers ceased to exist, killed wounded, or captured. An entire army group dissolved. The defensive line that had held for 3 years vanished overnight, all because they looked exactly where Stalin wanted them to look. The deception was perfect. The execution was flawless. The result was the greatest military disaster Germany experienced in World War II. German soldiers who survived, who escaped the encirclements or were captured and later released, spent the rest of their lives trying to understand what happened. How had an entire army group been destroyed so quickly? How had they missed an army of 2.4 million soldiers hiding in forests? How had Soviet deception been so complete that every German assessment was wrong? Marshal Zhukov later explained, "The success of Bagration depended on 3 factors: surprise, speed, and overwhelming force. We achieved surprise through systematic deception. We achieved speed through careful planning and ruthless execution. We had overwhelming force because we'd been preparing for 3 months while the Germans looked elsewhere. When these 3 factors combined, the result was annihilation. Not defeat, annihilation. German divisions didn't retreat in good order. They were destroyed where they stood or in futile attempts to escape encirclements. The Wehrmacht in Belarus was erased." The strategic consequences extended beyond the immediate battle. Germany had lost Army Group Center, one of 3 major army groups on the Eastern Front. Replacing those losses was impossible. German industrial production couldn't manufacture enough equipment. German population couldn't provide enough replacement soldiers. From Bagration forward, Germany would be fighting defensive retreat. Every subsequent battle would be about slowing Soviet advance, not stopping it. The question was no longer whether Germany would lose, but how long collapse would take. For Soviet forces, Bagration proved they'd transformed from desperate defenders in 1941 to the world's most powerful military in 1944. They'd mastered combined arms warfare, operational deception, and deep battle theory. They could destroy German forces at will. The road to Berlin was open. Soviet tank columns that had annihilated Army Group Center would keep advancing west, through Poland, into Germany itself, eventually surrounding Berlin and forcing German surrender. But that's a different story. This story is about the 23 days in June-July 1944 when the Red Army pulled off the greatest magic trick in military history, when they made 500,000 German soldiers vanish through perfect deception and overwhelming force. The Germans went to bed confident on June 23rd. By breakfast on June 24th, their world had ended. The front line they'd held for 3 years simply ceased to exist, replaced by Soviet tank columns driving west through forests that were supposed to be empty. Maskirovka, the art of military deception. Show the enemy what you want them to see. Hide what you don't want them to know. Then strike where they're not prepared, with overwhelming force they can't resist. The German officers finishing cognac in Minsk on June 23rd never imagined what was coming. They died not knowing they'd been deceived. They thought they'd been overwhelmed by surprise Soviet offensive. They were half right. They were overwhelmed. But it wasn't a surprise. It was the culmination of 3 months of perfect deception that convinced them to look in exactly the wrong direction. In magic, the key to any trick is misdirection. Make the audience look left while you work right. Convince them the trick is impossible so they don't see the method. Stalin and Zhukov performed the greatest misdirection in military history. They convinced Germany's intelligence apparatus, supposedly sophisticated, yet experienced professionals, to watch Ukraine while 2.4 million Soviet soldiers assembled in Belarus. Then they destroyed an entire army group in 23 days. Every schoolchild should know this story. It's bigger than D-Day, more decisive than Stalingrad, more perfectly executed than any military operation in modern history. But history, like magic, is about misdirection. We remember what we're told to remember. We forget what's inconvenient to recall. So Operation Bagration, the greatest magic trick in military history, remains forgotten in the West while we celebrate smaller, more familiar victories, The 450,000 German soldiers who vanished in Belarus deserved better than to be forgotten. The Soviet soldiers who destroyed them deserve recognition for achieving what seemed impossible. The story deserves to be remembered. How perfect deception, overwhelming force, and flawless execution combined to make 500,000 soldiers simply disappear in 23 days. The forests of Belarus remember. The vanished German divisions are buried there. The truth remains, even if popular memory has moved on to more comfortable narratives. This is the story history tried to forget. The 23 days when Soviet forces annihilated an entire German army group while the world watched Normandy beaches instead. Remember Operation Bagration. Remember the greatest magic trick in military history. Remember the 23 days when 500,000 soldiers vanished because they looked exactly where their enemies wanted them to look.